Well, good morning everybody. It's another Monday, and today I'm going to talk about some of these cloaked concerns that will bite you. You might remember I talked about this when I was working at the Volkswagen dealership. We did a lot of valve adjustments, and you know, they had the shims on the cam followers that were underneath. It was a little cup that rode on top of the valve, and you had to adjust those valves. And there was a setting for the exhaust valves and a setting for the intake valves, and we did so many of those, and we did them so fast, you know, they just do them all the same way. And one day I noticed that was one of them that had the valves that were very, very loose. Now, it wasn't causing a problem really, but there's some specs you're supposed to adhere to. Well, the problem with that was those buckets that shoved down into that, you know, machine bore where the valve was hadn't been going as deep as they were supposed to, because the shims were a little too thin on top of the carriers. And whenever I adjusted the valves within spec, everything was fine when the motor was hot. But when he started it up cold, every single time one of those cups went down in its bore, it would stick in the varnish that was below the cup, and then the piston would hit the valve and knock it back up. And it made all the clinkety clink noise that when it was running, and he just threw a screaming fit about that. Well, see, that was a landmine. It was a cloaked problem that didn't appear until after I did what I was supposed to do and adjusted the valves. And I had two choices. I could take that thing all apart and clean all that varnish out of there, which he wasn't going to pay for that. And so what I did on that one, and it didn't hurt a thing, I just went and set the valves back the way that they were. Put the thinner shims back in there so that they wouldn't travel so deep into the bore. And then I cleaned the engine up real good and sprayed it with some clear stuff to make it look pretty. But that was one of those things that I didn't do anything wrong, but I did a bunch of extra work because of something that blew up in my face. Well, every now and then we'll run into one that's got something covering it up. But listen to this. Now, this has got one of those overrunning alternators. Unless you have any other trouble with that. Does it change cells when you turn on the air conditioner? Is the air conditioner cool? Tell you what I want you to do. It's cooling or it's not? It's not. All right, that could be something else. I want you to pull the belt off of it. That may be an alternator, because it's got an overrunning pulley on it. We want to make sure, okay? Before we don't want to just throw an air conditioner pressure. If you take the belt off and feel that thing, you'll be able to tell. And this is the pulley. It's spring and a bearing that had the seal gone out of it. That was the noisy pulley. It's a whole different critter with a new pulley on the alternator. Outstanding performance. Looks really good. Alright, the point of that is sometimes you just need to be familiar with what can cause the kind of problem you're listening to. When you got a lot of belts and pulleys spinning, you really don't know which one of those is making that racket. And this racket on this one was worse when the air conditioner was on than it was when it wasn't. That could be the tensioner, but in this particular case it turned out to be that overrunning pulley on the alternator. And those things do fail. You can get just the pulley. It costs about $60 from the parts house. But one way or another, that was fairly straightforward. You just had to know what to do in order to vector your way to the fix surgically, so that you weren't replacing all the pulleys, all the belts, the AC compressor, and the tensioner just to get rid of the noise. It was going straight to what it was and looking for a telltale signature like that rust that had come out of that pulley that was all over the front of that alternator was a telltale sign. That strange noise issue, back in 1977 I was working at that shop I talk about sometimes, and one day this truck, it was a 70 model Ford, it came in there through it with a V6 in it, I mean V8 in it, 302 whatever, Anyway, I said, what is this racket here? And it sounded horrible. I mean, I'm telling you, you'd think this thing had an engine knock. It was ridiculously loud and harsh sounding. And the boss man says, switch the truck off. And so I switched the truck off, and he cut the belts off with his pocket knife, and we cranked it up, and it made no noise at all. Turned out that the belts had big chunks missing out of them. I've seen belts with chunks missing before, but I've never heard nothing make a noise like that. That was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. But that was something I watched happen and saw it experience. And that just opened my eyes that just because you hear a knocking noise doesn't mean the engine is shot. But there are other times when it does. Anyway, this 2005 Titan was a noisy one. And it hadn't been driven for a while because the owner was certain the engine was destroyed. She wanted us to listen to it. So she and her husband had driven it until the oil light came on, she said, and they kept driving it. Well, that sounded serious, but we figured we'd just, do a straight up evaluation anyway. And so she left the truck one night after we were closed, and the next morning we looked at it, and we noticed two things. First, before we even started it, we found the oil wasn't even touching the stick. It's always a good idea before you start one to pull the dipstick and see what's showing. Nothing on there. But we only had to put 3 quarts in it in order to get it full up. And I've seen vehicles run with, down to less than a quart of oil and, still survive that. My buddy Alan's Ford pickup did that. But it wasn't low enough for engine damage as far as we could tell, and she didn't mention having to add any oil. She didn't say anything about an oil leak or having to add any oil. But when we started the engine, it was rattling to beat the band. And most law was in the bell housing area when we got under it and was listening, and the oil from the rear main seal was leaking really, really fast, and it made a puddle nearly 2 feet in diameter within 3 minutes. Now remember, they hadn't driven this thing for a while. Now, we don't usually see a pressure-driven leak that bad on the side unless it's a double-gasketed oil filter or something like that somebody has messed up on. So what it turned out was she had a cracked flywheel. I said, we're going to go in there and look at this flywheel because there's a lot of noise. I mean, a lot of noise was coming out of the bell housing area. And so when we pulled the transmission out, and it's a pretty big job on this Titan, we found this busted flywheel, and it had been cracked for a while. And you can see the cracks here around the center, which is fairly common. They crack around the center like that. And this flywheel is a strange one. It's got 2 layers built together, kind of laminated together there, except there's space between them. I'm not sure why they built it that way, unless they were wanting just one part of the plate to flex and the other part to hold the starter gear. But it also had cracks radiating out from that center. I mean, this thing had been, and it was, that was a recipe for making, and I've heard cracked flywheels go tick, 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 tick before, but this one here was, I mean, it was super loud. So anyway, so I says, she had let us jerk the transmission out and see the flywheel. And we drained the transmission oil that was kind of black, and we put new transmission juice in it too. And that transmission on that one has a metal screen, like some of the really old, Ford C4s and C6s. You can clean that screen, put it back on there. Well, we got it all steam cleaned, the muddy transmission and all that, put it all back in there. And flywheel wasn't going to be here for a couple of days, so we moved on to another job. Okay. Now this is knocker.
Got a little bit of a knocker here.
This is more detail on that, by the way. But the guy actually brought the vehicle, and he brought an engine too that he wanted to put in there. And so this is what the catalytic converter looked like when we got our borescope hooked to the Autel tool and looked through the oxygen sensor hole. I mean, boy, this thing had busted up. And this is a problem on some vehicles. Some of your Ford SHO engines back in the early days, in the late 80s, like 89, 90, they would do this kind of hogwash. The catalytic converter would come apart, and those rocks would be bouncing around in the exhaust and would get picked up by the EGR system and then funneled into the where the cylinders were in the combustion chambers, and it would start the engine to knocking. I mean, it would just destroy the motor. Basically, you got, rocks and sand, bouncing around in there that came out of this busted up clay brick. Now, we opened up the catalytic, took the oxygen sensor off of the one, the motor he brought had a catalytic converter on it already. And so we looked down in there, and this is what we're supposed to see. This is not what you're supposed to see when you look into a catalytic converter. That looked perfect, so we went ahead and put it on there with that one. Now, the replacement was steel and chalky on the aluminum. It looked like it had been sitting somewhere damp. But I turned it with a breaker bar, and it turned real easy. And we could look under the valve cover. There was no oil sludge in there that we could see, no appreciable oil sludge. And that's always important when you're getting a used engine. If you don't know how much sludge is in there, you better do something to find out. We went ahead and put a rear main seal in it and this kind of stuff. We basically wanted to, and the ones that have a timing belt on them, you need to go ahead and just replace the timing belt while you're there. And if it's got a water pump that's right there, you just go ahead and pop a water pump, a timing belt, put a new thermostat in it. And it's a good idea. If it's got an oil cooler, you better replace that too, especially if there was a lot of metal and stuff. So anyway, we did everything we could. Got it all put back together, but whenever Justin got the motor put back in there, the doggone thing wouldn't start. And it turned out when we got to investigating that, you see these ground wires right here? When I was looking and trying to figure out why it wouldn't start, it wouldn't operate the fuel injectors or anything else. These two ground wires that are supposed to be connected right here were swinging out here, and here's the place where they're supposed to go. That wasn't too bad. So we wound up getting that one straightened out that way, and it fired up and ran, and the customer was really happy with it and all that. So we put his motor in there, and so all right. This is a 2012 Fusion AC issue. I'm gonna spend a little time on this one because this one here bumfuddled me, and it still does until this day. Incidentally, I fought with this thing for a while, and I wanted to just up front say that after I fought with this thing, I went online looking to see if anybody else had this problem with a Ford Fusion. And this one guy said that his air conditioner was doing this. What it would do is it would start out cooling just fine, then it would freeze up the evaporator, and it would stop passing any air, and it would get hot in the car. And so he said that he left his vehicle for 2 weeks at a Ford dealership in Georgia, and they could not figure out why that evaporator was freezing up. So he had to take the car and drive down to Florida to do on some business. So he drove the car down to Florida, and he put it in a dealership down there for the same problem. And he said they worked on it 2 weeks, and they couldn't figure out why it was freezing up. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I couldn't find any definitive reason why this thing would do this. But what the deal was, I had the IDS connected, and it was reading 48 degrees as an evaporator temperature sensor. Now your older AC systems, some of them had an evaporator temperature alcohol tube in there, and it went to a cutout switch, and that was there. So if the evaporator got too cold, the low pressure cutout switch on the older ones, and I'll show you that in a minute, was there for the same reason, because temperature and pressure are tied together closely on refrigerant. And so if the temperature of the refrigerant, if the pressure is low, the temperature is going to be low too, and that really low pressure coming out of the evaporator means it's getting too cold. Either that or it's low on refrigerant. Either way, it needs to cycle the compressor off. Well, this is what was coming out of the register. We were at 20 degrees coming out of the register, and these readings were taken at the same time. In other words, this reading right here was taken at the same time this reading was taken, which was just mind-boggling. Couldn't figure out. I said, well, there's some module. Well, we initially replaced the evaporative temperature sensor. Usually they fail the other way, and the AC doesn't kick on at all. I've never seen one fail this way. Okay, so what we had was, this is the evaporator temperature sensor. It's what it looks like. You got to pull the dash back, put it in there, and it's just basically a 2-wire thermistor with a certain amount of resistance. And I measured the resistance on the old one. I don't remember the numbers, but it measured the same as the new one through all temperature ranges as far as I can tell. You can use a heat gun and measure it and all that kind of stuff. There's also an AC pressure transducer that's down here, and I'll show you in a second where that's at. But everything was, you know, seemed to be working the way it was supposed to, except the temperature wasn't reading right. And this sensor was the one that temperature was coming out of wrong. All right, so this suction line here was frozen solid whenever it was going through this thing. Now there's that high pressure switch. It's a transducer, and it's basically telling the computer what the high pressure is, you know, in that liquid line. And so basically your refrigerant travels this way, goes to the compressor, goes through the condenser, and it comes back through this expansion valve. And the expansion valve is also supposed to choke down the refrigerant when it gets, you know, whenever the refrigerant here, I mean, when this is too cold. And the reason I never pursued the expansion valve, and I probably should have, another problem was that she wouldn't let us work on it but a little bit at the time, because she wanted us to work on it while she was at work. Wouldn't leave it with us, couldn't. She had to drive it home. And so every day was a brand new day. We had to start all over, you know. But anyhow, I replaced this thing. It was easy to do, didn't cost much, and there was a guy that I respect that works at Ford place that said that he had fixed one by putting that on there that was doing a similar problem. But I didn't have that experience. Now this is where that evaporator sensor is. Whenever the blower is bringing air through the evaporator, it's measuring the air that's flowing toward the resistor through this chamber, and that thing is supposed to not let the evaporator freeze up. But the actual resistor temperature was 20, but this stupid thing was reading 48.2. I mean, 20 degrees. And if it never reads any lower, that's going to run the compressor continuously trying to pull this number down, which it wasn't able to do, and that was annoying. I even temporarily made this modification to see what would happen. I took a good one of these. They didn't cost but about $28, and I bought one, and I put it into the outlet right behind this, so that my mind was, if I can get, and I actually had it wired up just like the other one was, but it was taking its temperature readings from in here, the same place I was reading with my little thermometer. And I said, if I can get it to read what the thermometer's reading, and it'll cycle a compressor off, you know. And I had mounted that thing so beautifully and all with so that it was perfect and it wasn't going anywhere. And I had the wires, you know, I had the other one out of the loop, and I had this one wired up the same way the other one was, except the box wouldn't know. You know, actually we replaced that control box too, but I'll show you that again in just a second. But the airflow across this thing was still going down to 20 degrees, and this thing still wasn't reading right, in spite of the fact that it was reading the temperature from the same place that thermometer was. And so this was getting really dicey, you know. Alright, so this is the fusion wiring layout. Now I had to cobble this together from several different diagrams, which is very annoying to me that you have to flip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from one page to the other. You know, they won't just give you a nice even picture of what this is supposed to look like. They actually have, you know, part of it here, part of it on another page. Everybody that's ever looked at a wiring schematic understands what I'm talking about. Well, this is a smart junction box. And you might notice that the HVAC controller on the medium speed CAN bus talks to the smart junction box, which is kind of like the gateway module, and it sends that information to the PCM. And the PCM, now you can actually, as I remember, the IDS, you can access the HVAC controller with the IDS, and you can also access the PCM. The HVAC controller was what we were looking at, and it was what was reading that bad temperature, right? But the PCM, by way of this, gets, of course, there's your DLC. The PCM gets its marching orders on whether or not to run the compressor clutch. See? And so you're talking through a network here, through the smart junction box, and out here. And of course there's your blower controller and all that. You know, I put that on there for fun. And this are all part of the same thing. This battery junction box and this one are the same box. The smart junction box has got a computer in it. you know, is network friendly and all that. So anyway, that's what I was looking at. I like to take and cobble these together. You notice you got this, here's your evaporator discharge sensor. You got reference voltage feeding all three of these, the in-vehicle temp sensor, the ambient air sensor, and the evap discharge temp sensor, which is the one that we were talking about. All of those are fed by the same reference voltage, and they got three different signals going in. It's fairly common. But anyway, here I was looking at this. So this PCM was keeping that running because it was reading a temperature that was higher than it should have through this box, through that bus. See what I'm talking about? This right here, you ought to see all the modules this thing has on it. There's more computer code, 250,000 lines of computer code, I mean, or something like that, on a Ford Fusion, and only 6,000 lines of computer code on a F-35B Joint Strike Fighter. You know, some of these cars are insane how many computers and how much computer code they got. Now, the way AC used to work was there was a low pressure cutout switch on the fixed orifice systems. Here's an orifice system. And that low pressure cutout switch would open the circuit to the compressor or tell the PCM to turn the compressor off, however it was wired, whenever the gas pressure got too low here. And like I say, even if it's low on refrigerant, it still needs to cycle the compressor off so it doesn't destroy itself. And so this would flow this way through the evaporator, high pressure liquid. There would usually be a transducer here too, so the computer could keep track of that on the later models. And then it would basically go through there. Alright, see that? Now, there is, actually I got this from drawing it the right way. It goes this way. Sorry about that, screwed up. Alright, and it goes through the orifice tube, and then it goes into the evaporator, and it evaporates, and it goes into the accumulator, and the low pressure gas is here going into the compressor, and it starts all over again. Now this one has got an expansion valve. Now these will also, like on this one here, it had an evaporator temperature sensor and an expansion valve. But you might notice that you have an accumulator on the ones with an orifice tube and a receiver dryer on the ones that have an expansion valve. And then this expansion valve is reading the temperature of that tube, is what it's doing with an alcohol line that you can't see in this black screen I've got. But everything else is very similar, except this is supposed to throttle the amount of refrigerant going into the evaporator if it gets too cold, and it does that by measuring the temperature of this line right here, and that actually opens and closes. This is what they call this a fixed orifice, because it doesn't change, and this one here is an orifice. It's a variable orifice. Of course, they make some things like this that actually are variable too, but that's another story. There was a Pontiac G6 that had been worked on in the diesel department down there, and they said, hey, the alternator don't charge for some reason or another. So we raised it up on the lift after we determined that it wasn't charging. And they had taken right here, this is actually used as a junction post by most of your automotive manufacturers, and they like to connect the alternator terminal to this, and then this is also going to the battery. See, so the alternator charges through here and goes back to the battery. They had managed to hook the alternator terminal to the wrong one, which is the one going into the starter. This is an actual photo of what they did. And the one they were supposed to connect it to was the other one up here. They were supposed to connect it to that one, and they connected this fusible link wire to that one down there. So the alternator was trying to charge the, run the starter motor all the time. Although there wasn't any power there, except when you'd energize the starter, it would send power to the alternator, but when this connection was broken, the only place the alternator could charge, if it was charging at all, which it wasn't, was it would try and send its power right into the starter. Anyway, we fixed that. That wasn't a big deal. That was easy to find because there was no B+ measured at the alternator. If you measure that big post at the alternator, you ought to see some good, strong battery power there. If you don't see good, strong battery power there, you better find out why. Some of the systems nowadays have a fuse in them and all that. Now the flywheel came, and we put it in there, put it back together, and it was the end of a long day. We started it, but it didn't leak oil, and it ran really quiet. And I said, well, we got this straightened out. And so the next day we were I called her on the phone. I said, looks like we may have dodged a bullet here, but I won't know until I drive it tomorrow morning. And so I drove it tomorrow morning, we hear a knocking as soon as we dropped it into gear, and that was an engine knock, which was a different knock, but it had been covered up by the busted flywheel knock. And so we fixed the really loud noise, but she also needed an engine. Now, had we known this going in, and I don't know how we would have found this, except if we had made the if we had put it together that she said that they had driven it with the oil light on or something like that. I guess I should have. It was a bad call, but at the same time, that flywheel consumed all of our attention and everything. And yeah, we put a new flywheel on it. The stupid thing about this is, you know, she didn't want us to put a motor in it, so she says, "Oh, we're going to do something else." I said, "Okay, that's fine." So she took it back over to the other town. She paid I think the bill was like $400 for everything she did with the flywheel. And then she tried to call back and say, this other guy that was looking at this says that y'all didn't put a flywheel in this truck. And I says, well, I've still got the old one. And what I want you to do is have him take that flywheel off that's on it and bring it over here to me. And we're going to lay them side by side. And I'm going to show you, you know, because that's not just a generic flywheel. It's very unusual and very special on a Titan. And I told her, I says, bring the flywheel that he says that, you know, if he says we didn't replace it. And when I told her to bring that flywheel to me and let me look at it, she never showed, never called me back. That was over. She was just trying to get that money back, apparently, for the flywheel, because she felt, and basically we didn't sell her anything she didn't need, but we didn't go about the troubleshooting right. I should have pulled the pan off the thing first. I would have seen all this garbage in here, and the wall screen was stopped up and all that kind of nonsense. And every now and then when you rewind, you can say, well, I can see how I made this mistake, but I won't be fooled like this again, you know, hopefully. But anyway. Now this right here, I don't know if I mentioned this before, I think I did. This girl that was in my program, these plugs here came out of a Ranger. They had 2 plugs per cylinder. And my brother pulled these plugs out of his truck and they were burned up like this. Like, it was really just destroyed. And she said, so it was, you know, cutting out and misfiring. And I said, okay, I'll tell you what you need to do with this. I said, and the reason I said that was because she said he put 2 new plugs in it, and within a day they looked exactly like these did. And I said, he's got an intake valve that's leaking and it's pulling air in there, and it's basically like a torch. You know, you're pulling that extra oxygen into that one cylinder past that leaking intake valve, and it's making that fire super, super, super hot, and it's burning those plugs up. And I had seen that before on a 5.8 in a F-150 at the Ford place. It did that. And all the other cylinders, except for the one that was misfired, I think it was cylinder number 5, all the other cylinders had something like 170 pounds, and that one had 125, and it turned out it had an intake valve issue. There's more to that story, but this is what led me to tell her that. And so she said he looked and he found out he had a leaking intake valve, and that's what was wrong with it. These weren't the new plugs he put in, these were the old ones that he had pulled out, but the new ones were destroyed almost right away. This one is destroyed in a similar fashion for a different reason. One of my students, and this was a guy that seemed like he made the same kind of mistakes over and over and over. I never understood how this guy's mind worked. But you know how I've always said, whenever the spark plugs are down in a well, you don't just throw them down in there and then put your socket on them and hope they start straight. Well, he was somebody that tended to do that garbage. In spite of the fact that I tried to put it on a hose, start the plug, screw it in with your fingers, and follow up with your socket. And he screwed the threads up on this thing. He got it about that far screwed in. And that washer is there to conduct heat out of the spark plug. And on that particular engine, a little old 4-cylinder aluminum engine, I think it was in a Geo or something, he had screwed the threads up in his head, and he just kind of figured it'd be alright, and he didn't want to tell nobody about it. And so it came back the very next day, missing on that cylinder. When we brought the plug out, it brought some of the threads with it, and it looked like this, which is very similar to that. Well, this was because that washer never was compressed against the head to carry the heat out. So the heat tried to go through here, and it was insufficient, and it burned that plug up like a welding machine. It didn't take but 1 day to do this. He went home and back, and it did that, believe it or not. It won't do that every time you leave a plug loose, but it will on some engines, and that's what happened here. So we had to fix the threads, put another spark plug in there, and all that hogwash. That was That was a disaster all the way down the line. The blower resistor that we got from the parts store for this Chevy Silverado was supposed to fit. As a matter of fact, you can tell they tried to design it so that it would, and it's the one that the part said was supposed to fit. But it absolutely wouldn't work. I mean, we tried to put it in there, but look, see how this is angled the same way as that, and it's just built backwards. I never understood, and they swore up and down, yeah, that's supposed to fit and all, and it looked like you ought to be able to make it work, but we absolutely couldn't make it work. We had to get one from the dealership that was configured like the original one, and this cover went over it and all that stuff. But obviously this cover wouldn't work on that one. The relay was on the opposite end. The connector, you know, and the wires were coming out here instead of there based on the angle of it. It was just a mess. And I didn't understand all I knew about that. But anyway, we had to send this one back to the parts store. Now this right here was a 2000 Expedition that quit right out by the shop. The lady was leaving work. She worked at the college. And she said, hey, my Expedition has quit out here. And I went out there and the fuel pump wasn't running. And so I got to investigating that, and there was absolutely no continuity through the fuel pump to ground. So got the fuel pump out of it, and this thing right here had blistered and got hot and started doing the thing I'm always talking about, where it oxidized and then it got hot and it lost its tension and it built resistance. See how hot that thing was? So we had to get another connector that would plug into that and put a new fuel pump in there and just do all kinds of stuff to get that one going again. But that was and this one here actually has a fuel pump control module, so you couldn't actually check it at the relay like I always like to do. This was a beautiful cream puff of like a 68 or a 69 Chevy Nova. These things were everywhere when I was a guy growing up. Everybody loved them. This guy had restored this one apparently, and he broke down out there by the lumber yard. And I just took a picture of it because it was such a gorgeous car in an unusual situation. You know, the guy's down there with the hood up by the road, you know. But see, he got them big old fine back, wheels on the back. He'd make him a hot rod. Now this right here is a breach in the hose. See that hose spraying that water out for that coolant. Sometimes they make a little split like that, and they just, I mean, boy, they spray out of there and they get on the belts and make them squeal and all that kind of thing. Speaking of that, this was on a Windstar. This is actually the header photo I've got on my Technical Writer Facebook page, and they came in there wanting something, I can't remember what it was, that was belt related, and I saw that there was a coolant leak, and so we pressured the cooling system up after we pulled the belt off, and lo and behold, there was a crack running right down here. Never seen that before or since. There was a crack right there, and it was just spraying, just cooling out. I took that flash picture while it was spraying out. I was real proud of the way that turned out. You can see all the little droplets of coolant in the air and all that. But they did not even know they had this coolant leak. And see, you know, the belt was squealing because it had coolant on it, but they didn't know it was that for that reason. They thought it was something else. Well, we put a water pump on this one to straighten that nonsense out. Well, I hope you guys have a great week, and I can talk to you about this red Taurus, but I'm going to save that for another time. And I hope you guys have a great week, and let's all be careful out there, okay? See you next time.